At my dad's 60th birthday, they made me use the back door until someone said, "Madam CEO," and the room went silent. My name is Blake Lively. I'm 36 years old and the founder of Solis Grid, a renewable energy startup that now powers over 200 farming communities across the southern U.S. But that night, standing on the side path of my parents' ranch house in rural Texas, holding a gift carefully chosen for a man who had ignored my calls for years, none of it seemed to matter. When my younger brother Chase pointed toward the shed and said, "You should park back there. Use the side door, the front's for the guests," I didn't say anything. I smiled faintly, nodded, and turned the wheel, because that wasn't the moment to explain. Not yet. My father, Everett Lively, was a rancher with roots as deep as the pecan trees on our land, the kind of man who measured success in acres and inheritance, not innovation or equity. To him, Chase and my older brother Dean were the future of the Lively legacy. I was the daughter who ran off to California with a laptop. They were boots-on-the-ground cattlemen. I was solar panels and spreadsheets. And for nearly 15 years, that was enough to keep me on the fringes of family photos when I was included at all, growing up in Brazoria County. I was the odd one, not rebellious, just different. While my brothers spent summers learning feed schedules and tractor maintenance, I spent mine wiring backyard lights to mini solar cells made from leftover science fair kits. My dad once told a neighbor at church that I was just going through a phase. All girls grow out of tech stuff eventually. I was 12 by the time I graduated high school valedictorian. I had already filed my first provisional patent, a smart battery storage system I built in the barn, using surplus wires from a busted combine. My dad never asked about it. I left for Stanford on a full scholarship and didn't hear from him once during the 4 years I was gone. Not for birthdays. Not even when I made the cover of a student innovation journal. Mom called sometimes, always cautiously, like she was watching the weather change before stepping outside. And when I launched Solis Grid from a shared garage in San Jose at 24, she mailed me a card with 5 $20 bills taped inside. The message said, "For your dreams, sweetheart, but don't tell Dad. The real break happened the year I turned 28. I'd flown home for Thanksgiving, the only visit I had made since leaving for college, over dinner. My father passed the carving knife to Dean and announced that both he and Chase would be given the deed to the ranch, the land, the equipment, the house. "It's staying in the family," he said, and everyone nodded. I sat there stunned, a glass of untouched wine in my hand. "What about me?" I asked. The room went quiet. My father didn't even look at me. "You don't work the land," he said simply. "You chose your world. This one's not yours anymore." I left before dessert. I didn't call home for nearly 4 years after that. Not when Solis Grid secured a multi-million-dollar grant from the Department of Energy. Not when we opened our first field office in Louisiana. Not when we crossed into profitability or started attracting attention from agricultural journals. I poured everything into the business, maybe out of spite, maybe out of something deeper, and told myself I didn't care what my family thought. But that wasn't entirely true, because when the email came from my mother short, polite, not overly emotional, I read it twice. "Your father's turning 60. There's a dinner at the ranch. We'd like for you to be there. Please let me know." There was no, "He misses you." No, "We're proud." Just logistics. But I still bought a plane ticket. Still found myself standing on that dirt road outside our family home a week later, holding a custom-engraved solar charger shaped like a cattle brand, the closest thing to a peace offering I could manage. I should have known better. Should have known that even with the suit, the resume, the Forbes feature, I would still be told to use the back door. But what happened next? That, I promise, changed everything. I parked the car where Chase told me to, back by the equipment barn, next to a rusting hay baler and 2 mud-splattered ATVs. The dust kicked up as I stepped out in heels. A deliberate choice I had second-guessed 10 times on the flight. Now, standing between 2 tractors with nothing but silence and dry wind around me, I regretted not wearing boots, but then again, I was never allowed to wear them in their world, not really. The side door creaked like it hadn't been used since the last storm season. I stepped into the house I grew up in, where every inch should have felt familiar. But instead, I felt like a stranger arriving without warning. The kitchen smelled of burnt sugar and brisket. 2 women I didn't recognize glanced at me, then immediately looked away, assuming I was one of the caterers. No one greeted me. My name wasn't mentioned. Then I saw her, my mother, Lillian. Her back was to me, arranging a tray of deviled eggs like it was her lifeline. I cleared my throat gently. She turned, startled, eyes widening slightly, as if she had imagined I might not come. "Blake," she said softly, stepping forward with the same smile I remembered from childhood, warm, cautious, apologetic. "You look beautiful." I thanked her, meaning it, but before I could say more, one of the women nearby asked, "Do you want the helper to bring out the dessert tray?" Mrs. Lively. My mother's face stiffened. "That's my daughter," she replied, almost in a whisper. The woman's eyes widened in horror. She mumbled something and backed away, leaving behind a silence that pressed like weight on my shoulders. I gave a small smile, like I'd just brushed off a cobweb, and lifted the gift in my hand. "Where should I put this?" She nodded toward the dining room. "Everyone's gathering there now. You can leave it on the side table. Your father's in the living room." There it was again, that unspoken barrier. Your father. Not Dad, not he's excited to see you. Just location, not emotion, like coordinating furniture. I walked slowly toward the dining room. The house had been redecorated, but not much. A few newer photographs, mostly of Chase and Dean with their families, children I had never met, wives I had only seen on social media, in matching family portraits with hay bales and golden hour lighting. I didn't appear in any of the frames. On the wall beside the hallway, they had created a tribute wall for my dad's birthday. Dozens of photos from his life, clipped and pinned like a scrapbook on display, his childhood on the ranch, wedding with my mom, holding Dean in the hospital room, Chase on a tractor at age 5, their high school football victories, their weddings, their kids, but not a single photo of me past the age of 16. I looked carefully, scanned everything twice. Nothing. It was like I had been photoshopped out of the family story. I entered the living room as people laughed and passed drinks. The sound of boots on hardwood, low Texas drawls, polished belt buckles, and women in floral dresses sipping sweet tea. Everyone turned when Dean walked in, greeting him with applause and backslaps. He looked like a politician shaking hands. Then Chase arrived and was immediately swarmed by neighbors and old ranch partners. I stood near the doorway, invisible. Then I saw him, my father. His posture was stiff, chin lifted, eyes already scanning someone else as I approached. I waited until Dean noticed me first. "Dad," he said loudly, "look who's here." My father turned when his eyes met mine. I searched for something, anything, warmth, surprise, nostalgia. Instead, I got a polite nod. "Blake," he said flatly, "glad you made it. Not I missed you, not you look well. Just acknowledgement, like I was a former student at a school reunion." "Happy birthday," I said, handing him the gift. "I thought you might appreciate this." He took it without unwrapping it. "Thanks," he said, Placing it behind him, he turned back to the conversation without a second glance. And just like that, I disappeared again. Jason gave me a shoulder pat, as if that made up for the 10 years of silence. "Karen's around here somewhere," he said, referencing his wife. "She'll want to say hello." I nodded, but it wasn't a hello I needed. It was the recognition that I was part of this family too, that I hadn't disappeared just because I didn't wear boots to work. Dinner was announced soon after. I was seated at the far end of the hall with 3 guests I didn't know. My brothers and their wives sat near my parents at the main table. I was close enough to hear them talk about cattle prices and weather patterns, about a new grain silo being installed in the south field. They never once asked me about Solace Grid, or how I was doing, or even what I had been building all these years. I wasn't curious anymore. I was angry, but even more than that, I was tired of being erased in slow motion, tired of pretending the distance was just time, tired of telling myself that showing up was enough. And still, I stayed. I stayed through the toasts. I stayed when Dean told the story of how Dad taught him to rope cattle. I stayed when Chase handed Dad a framed aerial photo of the ranch and got a bear hug in return. I stayed because I knew the moment was coming. I didn't know when or how, but I knew, because people like my father think silence is power, that ignoring someone is a form of control. But silence also creates tension. And when the right voice cuts through that silence, everything shifts. After dinner, people drifted toward the porch with their wine glasses and birthday cake slices. Laughter spilled out from the sliding glass doors. I stayed behind in the kitchen, rinsing my plate under cold water like a stranger trying to be useful. My mother passed behind me, touching my elbow briefly as if to say, "I see you," but not aloud. Then she disappeared, called away by someone needing napkins or one of the grandkids asking for apple pie. I found myself alone again, not excluded this time by a decision, but by years of small silences that had hardened into routine. I needed air. I stepped out the side door, not the front out of habit. Maybe. The sun was dropping behind the barn, painting everything in honeyed gold. I stood there quietly, breathing in the smell of dry earth and warm wood, until I heard footsteps behind me. It was Dean. He walked with his arms crossed, his mouth tight, like he was trying to make a decision before speaking. "Hey," he said. "Finally. You okay?" I gave him a look. He exhaled, glanced down at my shoes, and then said it. "If you're heading back in, maybe go around the side again. Mom just had the carpets cleaned." It wasn't the words that stung, it was the indifference in them. The assumption that I was the problem, that my shoes, cleaner than his, were a threat to his comfort. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just stood still as he walked away, not even turning back to see if I was following his suggestion. I stayed outside longer than I should have, replaying the whole evening in my mind. From the moment I arrived, I had been reduced to the outsider. No name on the photo wall, no seat at the family table, no warmth from my father, and now no front door. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved. As I stood beneath the porch light, something shifted in the energy of the house. I heard the front door swing open. The murmur of conversation paused, and then a voice rang out, confident, cheerful, and loud enough to turn heads. "Excuse me." It called, "Is Blake Lively here?" I was told she might be attending. The name landed like a rock dropped into still water. I walked toward the front door slowly, the way one walks into a room filled with old ghosts. Inside stood a man in his 50s, in a tailored gray blazer and polished boots that gleamed under the entryway light. My eyes widened as I recognized him, Mark Delaney. Regional Director of Everbright Infrastructure, one of the largest renewable funding coalitions in the western U.S. He had been a panelist with me last year in Austin. I'd spoken on a stage with him, answered his direct questions about community microgrids, and handed him my card personally afterward. I hadn't known he'd remember me, apparently. He had. There she is, he said when his eyes found mine. His voice broke into a grin. Madam CEO of Solace Grid, it's an honor. And just like that, the room shifted. People looked. My father looked. Even Chase stopped mid-conversation. Mark walked over and shook my hand like we were old colleagues. I heard your name from the guy at the Chamber of Commerce. Told me you might be out here for your father's birthday. So I took the chance. I've been meaning to reach out anyway. Our team's looking at expanding support for low-footprint energy projects in ranching regions. Your work is exactly what we've been discussing. I smiled, steady but controlled. I'd love to talk more. Oh, we will, he said easily. In fact, I just read the article in Agritech Monthly, your interview on scalable solar irrigation, that's been circling our office all month. You're doing incredible work. Behind him, I saw Dean blink. Chase shifted his weight uncomfortably. My father didn't speak. He stared, as if trying to understand what was happening, but refusing to adjust fast enough to catch up. Mark looked around and added, almost too casually, I imagine your family must be incredibly proud of the impact you're making. Silence again, the kind that doesn't just fall, it lands. I glanced at my father. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. If he felt anything like pride, it didn't show. They're proud in their own ways, I said. I saw Mark register the tension, but steer away from it like a seasoned politician. Well, let me not interrupt the celebration, he said, handing me a business card. We'll be in touch. Then to my father. You've raised a visionary, Mr. Lively. It's a rare thing. With that, he tipped his head and walked out the front door, not the side, not the kitchen, the front like someone who knew where he belonged. In the silence that followed, the family began shifting. Conversations restarted, but this time, they swirled toward me. People I hadn't spoken to all evening asked polite questions. Someone even said they'd heard something about that company in a magazine. My nephews wandered over to ask what solar irrigation meant. I answered kindly, clearly, like a professional, like someone used to being listened to. And then, my father moved toward me, I thought. For one moment, he might say something, but instead, he picked up a plate of pie, turned, and walked away. Not a word. It was the clearest message he had ever given me. The celebration carried on without me. I moved through the rest of the evening like a shadow, smiling when spoken to, answering questions politely, avoiding confrontation. But inside, something had cracked open, not in a dramatic, tear-filled way, more like a quiet shift in the tectonic plates of how I saw this family. The applause that once meant something no longer held weight. The polite conversation suddenly sounded hollow, and the way my father had walked away after Mark Delaney's praise, that was the final confirmation of something I had known for years but refused to name until now. He wasn't proud of me. Not because I failed, but because I succeeded without him. Around 9:30, I slipped out through the kitchen. No one stopped me. I walked back toward the barn to get some air. The field stretched out under a deepening sky, and for a moment, I just stood there in silence. I remembered being 16, sneaking out with an old flashlight to test the first DIY solar circuit I had wired to a motion sensor. I remember how proud I felt watching that dim bulb flicker to life under a moonless sky. I had rushed in that night to tell Dad. He didn't look up from his invoice sheet. I told you, he said, That stuff's fine for science fairs. It doesn't work in the real world, but it did. It worked then, and it works now. The world had changed. I had changed, only he hadn't. I sat on the fence, staring at the silhouette of the old tractor shed. Then, footsteps approached. I expected my mom. It was Dean. He stood for a moment, hands in pockets, watching me quietly. He's just old-fashioned, he said, like it was a justification. He doesn't mean anything by it. I didn't look at him. You all keep saying that, but somehow it always ends with me being the one left out. Dean let out a breath. We didn't know Mark would show up. Caught us all off guard. That's not the problem. I said, the problem is, you only saw me after he did. Dean stayed quiet. Then finally, you could have told us about the company. We read about it now and then. Sure, but you never really said anything. I laughed quiet, bitter. I sent clippings, articles. I emailed updates. I called on holidays. No one replied. And you're telling me the reason you ignored me for a decade is because I didn't present myself like a sales pitch. Dean flinched but didn't deny it. Things change. He muttered, maybe it's time we all try again. Try again. I echoed, the words flat in my mouth. That's easy to say now. When you think I can offer something. When Mark Delaney says my name out loud, and suddenly I'm no longer the girl with city shoes. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, and for a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said, Curtis thinks you left too early, that you gave up on this place. I turned to face him. Curtis didn't speak to me for 10 years. Neither did you. So maybe it wasn't me who gave up. He didn't answer, just nodded and walked away into the night, disappearing like smoke into the dark. I returned to the guest house quietly. It had been offered almost like a formality, not a real welcome. I dropped my shoes by the door, sank into the edge of the bed, and stared at the travel bag still zipped on the chair. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness, from resolve. I didn't fly here for a second chance. I flew here because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to confirm, one last time, that no matter how successful I became, I would never be enough, not in their eyes. And now that I had, I felt oddly clear. The next morning, I packed early. The sky was still gray and cool when I stepped out. My flight wasn't until the afternoon, but I wanted to be gone before the house woke up. I left the gift behind on the mantel. He hadn't unwrapped it. I didn't care. As I reached the edge of the driveway, the front door opened. My mother stood there in a sweater, arms crossed over her chest, watching me with the quiet ache of someone who knew she couldn't fix what had been broken for too long. Leaving already, she asked. I nodded. Didn't see the point in staying longer. I'm sorry, she said, barely above a whisper. For what I asked, for not speaking up. She didn't reply, but her eyes said yes. I stepped forward and gave her a hug. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was a gesture from one woman who had learned to survive in silence to another who no longer would. On the drive back to Houston, I thought about Solus Grid, about the interns waiting for Monday's demo, about the prototype we were testing in Arizona next week, and about a project I'd shelved months ago, an outreach initiative aimed at providing solar kits and digital literacy to under-resourced ranch communities. I'd hesitated to pursue it because I thought I might be accused of trying to show up my family. But now I saw it clearly. It was never about them. It was about people like me, girls who grew up under the weight of not yours, and still found the courage to build anyway. Back in my apartment that evening, I unpacked slowly. Then I sat down and drafted a letter, not to my father, not to Dean or Chase, to the Department of Agricultural Equity a funding proposal for the Rural Solar Education Initiative. Fully backed by SolisGrid, I called it Second Light, because sometimes the first place you're told not to belong is exactly where you're meant to lead. The weeks after the party moved faster than I expected, I returned to my office in Austin and dove straight into work. SolisGrid was entering a critical phase. 3 new pilot communities in New Mexico had just completed installation, and our data showed an unprecedented 28% improvement in water use efficiency. The engineering team was celebrating. Investors were circling, but inside me, something deeper was shifting. For the first time in years, I wasn't pushing forward to prove anything to my family. I was doing it because I finally saw the truth with no filter. I had built something real, whether or not they ever looked, on a quiet Thursday afternoon. My assistant knocked. "Blake," she said carefully. "You have a visitor. Says his name is Chase Lively." I paused mid-sentence, blinked, then asked. "He's here in the lobby," she confirmed. "Wants to talk about something urgent." I took a breath, stood up, and walked out without saying another word. There he was, my younger brother, dressed in worn jeans and a button-up with dust still clinging to his boots like a badge of identity. His posture wasn't confrontational. It was uncertain. That alone surprised me. "Can we talk?" he asked. Not in command, but in request. I nodded. "Come on back," in the conference room. He didn't sit right away. He hovered like someone unsure if they belonged. I let the silence stretch until he filled it. "We've been having some issues with the irrigation on the east side of the ranch. The system Dad insists on using is 10 years old. It's inefficient, wastes a ton of water." I told him that, but he won't listen to me, just says it worked fine when he was my age. I folded my arms. "So why are you here?" He looked down, then back up. "Because I've seen what your company does. I saw the case study in the magazine. I know you're doing real work. He hesitated. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to take a look. Not for him, for me." I didn't respond immediately. There was no satisfaction in seeing my brother, who had told me to use the side door, now asking for help. Only clarity. This was what progress looked like, not a victory speech. Just someone who had once overlooked you now showing up. Humbled. I finally nodded. "Send me the specs and coordinates. I'll have my team do an assessment. If the numbers check out, we'll propose a solution. Commercial rates apply." "Of course," he said quickly. "Whatever it costs. We can discuss that." He started to stand, then stopped. "By the way," he added, almost like an afterthought, "Dad read the magazine, the one with the interview." He didn't say anything, but I saw him fold the page and put it in his drawer. It hit differently than I expected. Not joy, not redemption, just a quiet shift of air, like a door somewhere had opened a crack. "Thanks," I said. He left without another word, and I sat back in the chair, staring at the empty space where he'd been, wondering how long it would take for the rest of them to catch up. 2 weeks later. The SolisGrid install team arrived at the Lively Ranch. Not through the back road, not hidden. We brought 2 trucks and 3 engineers, parked in front like we would with any client. My name wasn't mentioned once in the paperwork, but everyone on site knew whose system they were putting in. I stayed off property during the setup. It wasn't about showing up. It was about making space. When the install finished, I sent the final report directly to Chase. He replied within an hour. "Numbers are better than we expected. Already seeing a drop in water use. I'll keep you posted." Then came the ripple effect. Within a month, 3 neighboring ranches requested consultations after seeing the results at our family farm. And this time, they weren't calling Chase. They were calling Solus Grid. One client even said, "If your tech is good enough for Everett Lively's place, it's good enough for me." I didn't reply. I just filed it away in my inbox, a quiet receipt for the years they said I didn't belong. It wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about narrative. I had stopped fighting for acknowledgement and instead let the value speak for itself. The system worked. The land responded. The neighbors noticed. And suddenly, the ones who once excluded me were now measured by the same tools they had dismissed. That wasn't revenge. That was consequence. By the end of that quarter, Solus Grid's rural program had tripled its inquiries. Mark Delaney reached out again, asking if I'd consider joining a statewide advisory board on agricultural energy equity. I accepted. But privately, I started working on something more personal, a small fund using a percentage of Solus Grid's net proceeds to support women in rural areas studying environmental science. I didn't name it after myself. I called it the Side Door Project, because there are too many brilliant minds out there being told to park in the back. 3 months passed before I heard from my father again. Not a call, not a visit, just a short, typed email sent at 6:04 in the morning with no greeting. The subject line read, "Soil pressure readings." The message itself was only one sentence. "Can you review the latest data and see if that east slope issue is drainage or compaction?" No, please. No, thank you. No mention of who I was to him, just the kind of email he might send to a contractor. I read it 3 times, closed my laptop, and sat in silence. It wasn't the message that got to me. It was the fact that for the first time in over a decade, he asked me to solve something he couldn't. I forwarded the data to my engineering lead with a short note. Priority. Please model with our soil sensor overlay. Will advise. Then I opened a folder on my desktop labeled Lively. It had been empty until now. The results came back 2 days later. It was a classic slope compression issue, decades of repeated tractor runs in a single direction without rotation. Old mistake, easy fix with the right technology and a new planting strategy. I packaged the report, added a visual overlay, and replied with a clear breakdown of the problem and solution. Ending the message with recommend reversing machine paths next season. We can offer monitoring if desired. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. That night, for the first time, I let myself look at our company's internal dashboard and click on the tab labeled Family Install. There it was, the Lively Ranch, monitored like any other client, but it didn't feel like any other. It felt like the past, quietly admitting it couldn't win against the future. Then, one morning in October, my assistant handed me a printed invitation, formal, thick cardstock, addressed in cursive. It was from my mother. Thanksgiving at the ranch, handwritten at the bottom. Your father asked if you'd come. I stared at those words like they might vanish. My instinct was to say no, but something deeper told me to pause. It wasn't about validation anymore. It was about presence. So I said yes. When I arrived on Thanksgiving morning, no one told me where to park. No one pointed me to the back. Chase came out to the front porch when he saw my car and helped carry my bags like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stepped inside to the smell of cinnamon and sage, and there were photos on the hallway wall that hadn't been there before new ones. I didn't expect to be in any, but I was. One of them showed me on stage at a climate conference, mid-speech. Another was a clipping of my Forbes profile. I didn't ask who hung them. I didn't have to. Dinner was loud, full, and slightly chaotic in the way families always are during holidays. My niece Lily climbed into my lap before dessert and asked if I made sunlight into food. I smiled and said, kind of. And for the first time in my life, the table didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a gathering. My brothers talked to me like a sibling, not an outsider. They asked about the new facility we were building near Lubbock. Curtis even mentioned a rancher friend who was curious about our systems. I told him I could connect him to someone. He said, but maybe I should just give him your number instead. After the dishes were cleared, my father asked if I had a minute to talk. Not in front of everyone, not as a performance, just the two of us, on the back porch, under the same sky I used to stare at when I was a teenager, wondering what the rest of the world looked like. He held a mug of black coffee, steam curling up into the air. The east slope's better now, he said simply. Appreciate the help. I nodded. I'm glad it worked. He shifted his weight slightly. I don't always understand what you do or how it works, but I know the results, and I know the land hasn't looked this good in 5 years. I stayed quiet, let him find the next sentence on his own. He took a long sip of coffee, then added, I read the whole article this time, the one in Agritech. Had to ask your mother to explain a few parts. That made me smile, quietly. He looked down at the cup like it might give him courage. Then he said it. I was wrong. About you. About what you chose. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't flowery. But they were real. And in my father's language, that was monumental. You worked harder than all of us, he continued. Built something from scratch. Something that works. And I know I didn't make it easy. I know you felt pushed out. I didn't feel pushed out, I said. Finally, he nodded, not to argue, but to accept. Well, maybe it's time we change that. We stood there for a while without speaking, two people shaped by the same dirt, finally breathing the same air, not in perfect understanding, but in mutual respect. The silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was space by the end of the year. Solus Grid had expanded into 6 more rural regions. Our new pilot program in West Texas was producing results faster than any initiative we'd rolled out before. The Side Door Project had received matching grants from 3 nonprofits, and we began awarding our first round of scholarships to girls from farming communities, girls who, like me, had once been told that their place was in the kitchen or behind someone else's name. But despite all of it, I wasn't chasing headlines anymore. I didn't need the noise. Something had shifted. The more I stepped into my own value without demanding anyone's recognition, the more the world seemed to align on its own. One afternoon in late January, I got a call from the editor of Agritech Voices, a well-respected industry magazine. They were putting together a feature on multi-generational agricultural transitions, how traditional ranching families were beginning to collaborate with next-generation innovators. We'd love to include your family, she said. It's rare to find a story where both sides evolve and actually work together. I was quiet for a long second. My family hasn't given a quote. I replied, you'll have to ask them directly. But you can quote me on this legacy only matters when it grows. She laughed gently. That's a hell of a line. A week later, my dad called, not emailed, not passed a message through Chase. He called directly. No small talk. Just, I got a call from some writer, said you gave them our name. Is that something you want us to be part of? I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window toward the solar test field. It's not about whether I want it, I said. It's whether you think the story matters. He was quiet. Then, with a hint of dry honesty, well, I reckon it does now. They agreed to participate. The article came out mid-February. The photo was taken in the South Pasture. The one I used to be told not to step into when the men were working. This time, I stood in the center, flanked by my brothers and my dad. All of us dressed the way we were, no forced formality, no PR sheen. The headline read, "From Silence to Solar: How One Family Farm Found a Future in Innovation." I didn't send the article home. I didn't need to. My mom texted me a photo 2 days later. It was taped to the refrigerator. The more we worked together, the more the dynamic evolved, not into some perfect fairy tale collaboration, but into something functional, real. My dad still grumbled when we suggested updates. Curtis still rolled his eyes at software dashboards. But they listened, not because I forced them to, but because the evidence had become too solid to ignore. And for the first time, when they introduced me to neighbors, they didn't say she's got some company in the city. They said, she built Solus Grid. The pride wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In March, we were invited to speak at the Texas Agri-Energy Summit. My father, of all people, agreed to join me on a panel the night before. We sat in the hotel lobby, just the two of us, reviewing our talking points. He kept fidgeting with the pen in his shirt pocket like it didn't belong there. Then he looked at me and said, "I've read your presentation twice. Still don't understand every part, but I'll back it." I smiled, not to impress him, but because I realized something I didn't need him to fully understand. I just needed him to stand beside me. The next morning, when we took the stage, I introduced myself first. Then I turned toward him and said, "And this is Everett Lively, lifelong rancher and recently converted believer in sustainable energy." The crowd laughed. My dad nodded slightly, eyes narrowed, but not with irritation, with quiet amusement. "She's the expert," he said into the mic. "I'm just trying to keep up." That line made the recap reel. The journey didn't erase the past. It didn't fill in the years I spent proving my worth in silence, or the nights I lay awake wondering what it would have been like to grow up in a house where potential was measured equally. But it made peace with it, not by rewriting what happened, but by making sure it no longer defined what would later that week. My mother handed me an envelope before I left the ranch. Inside were photos, some printed, some clipped from magazines, my face in headlines, my name on conference stages. "I saved everything," she said, her voice soft. Even when I didn't know if he'd ever look, I didn't cry. I just nodded, placed the envelope in my bag, and thanked her not just for the papers, but for the quiet faith they represented. Because what I had built wasn't just a company. It was a bridge, one I had constructed with patience, with data, with proof, and most of all with the stubborn belief that I didn't have to shout to be heard. I just had to keep building until the silence couldn't ignore me anymore. 2 months after the summit, something unexpected happened. One of the largest neighboring ranches, the Lockharts, who had built a reputation for scorning any kind of modern approach, reached out to request a full consultation from Solus Grid. When I got the intake form, I paused at the field labeled "referred by." It simply said, "Everett Lively." That name carried weight in this region. For years, my father's word had been law among landowners. Now, the same man who once told me that real farms don't run on experiments was quietly recommending my name behind closed doors, not because I asked, not because I begged for recognition, but because the work spoke louder than I ever could. When we arrived at the Lockhart Ranch, the foreman greeted us with hesitation. "So, you're the Lively girl," he said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't welcoming either. "We heard good things." I smiled and shook his hand. "We'll let the data speak," I said, and it did. Within 3 weeks of testing, we identified outdated wiring, excess water loss, and soil degradation patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. Our solution cut their input costs by 17%. After that, they not only signed the deal, but featured us in their seasonal newsletter a year earlier. That idea would have seemed laughable, but something had shifted, not just in my family, but in the ecosystem that once ignored women like me entirely. Meanwhile, my relationship with Chase and Curtis continued to evolve. They didn't suddenly become best friends or model brothers, but they listened. They asked for input before decisions. Curtis even admitted during a call, "We should have talked to you sooner. I didn't rub it in. I just said, I'm here now." That, I've come to learn, is more powerful than any long speech. The biggest surprise, however, came in the form of a city permit. One Friday afternoon, my head of development walked into my office holding a letter. "Blake," she said slowly, "we just got a request from the county to fast-track installation of public solar stations at 4 locations along the rural commuter corridor. They want us to handle it directly." I nodded. "That's great." She hesitated. The request was signed by a new member of the Energy Planning Board, Everett Lively. I froze, not because I doubted it anymore, but because it meant he hadn't just changed privately. He was now publicly aligning his name with the thing he once dismissed. That weekend, I called him not to thank him, not to seek praise, but to understand. He picked up on the second ring. "You saw the permit," he said. "I did." Silence. Then, "It's about time they started listening to someone who actually knows how this stuff works." I smiled. "You mean me?" He didn't answer that directly. They were going to put in those overpriced city panels. Looked like a mess waiting to happen. I told them Solis Grid had better numbers and better sense. I leaned back in my chair. "Thanks for trusting me." "I trust results," he replied. "And yours keep showing up." That was his way of saying it. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but clearly. He had finally shifted from tolerating my success to standing behind it, quietly, but fully. We visited the 4 new sites together the following week. It was the first time I'd walked public land with my father as a collaborator. Not as a daughter tagging along, not as the girl who didn't belong in the fields, but as someone whose work shaped how the land functioned. He didn't say much during those visits, but every time he stepped aside to let me lead a conversation or pointed out something we could improve, I saw it for what it was: not concession, but respect. That evening, we returned to the ranch. He handed me an old photo as we sat at the kitchen table. It was faded, folded at the corners, a snapshot of me at 12, sitting in front of a dusty prototype I had built from scrap metal and lawn lights. I hadn't seen the photo in over 20 years. "Your mom took this," he said. "Said you stayed up 3 nights building that thing." I didn't get it then, but I kept it anyway. I looked at the picture, my 12-year-old self grinning, holding a wire in one hand and a plastic panel in the other. That version of me hadn't needed approval, just enough space to try. "You didn't say much that day." I told him. Didn't know what to say. He replied, "Still don't half the time, but I've been watching." For a moment, we just sat there. No performance, no big emotional scene, just quiet reckoning. That's how healing often begins, not with a grand apology, but with a photo pulled from a drawer and the courage to finally speak about it. The next season came quickly. Spring brought longer days, field tours, conferences, and the launch of Solis Grid's first youth innovation cohort. We selected 12 students, 8 girls, 4 boys, all from agricultural towns where access to resources was limited, but ideas were not. Each of them brought a story, some version of what I had lived, told they didn't belong, told to leave that to your brothers, told not to dream too far. And now, they were presenting prototypes in my office with wide eyes and calloused hands, asking questions no one had ever taken seriously before. I listened like someone who knew exactly what it meant to go unheard. One afternoon, as I stood by the whiteboard reviewing a presentation draft, my mother texted, "Would you consider coming home next weekend? Your father wants to show you something." I stared at the message for a long moment, unsure whether the ask was routine or something more. I replied with a simple, "What time?" When I pulled up to the ranch that Saturday morning, no one waited on the porch, but the front door was unlocked. I walked in, greeted by the smell of coffee and fresh paint. My father was in the backyard, standing near the greenhouse, the old one, the one I had built myself with salvaged glass and rusted nails when I was barely a teenager. It had stood for years, mostly untouched. Now it looked different, rebuilt, reinforced. The frame had been repaired. New panels glistened in the sun. Inside, the tables had been scrubbed clean, the beds replanted, native herbs, drip systems, and in the far corner, a sign carved in Cedar Blake's lab. He didn't say anything, just handed me a key. The way someone might hand over a steering wheel they once refused to let you touch. Thought it might be time it got used again, he said quietly. This place was yours long before anyone else saw it. I walked inside, hand over the tables, feeling the shape of old memories settle into new form. It wasn't grand. It wasn't for show. It was honest, earned, later that day. I sat on the porch with both my parents. Chase and Curtis had taken the kids into town, and for the first time in a long while, we were just 3 people, no titles, no distance. My mom poured sweet tea. My father opened the local paper. Then he surprised me again. They're doing a town award ceremony in June. He said, Legacy Builder Award. The council asked me to nominate someone. I told them I already had. Gave them your name. I blinked. You nominated me. I told them if you weren't building legacy. I didn't know who was, he said, flipping to the sports section like it wasn't a big deal. But I knew better. That wasn't just a nomination. That was a man who once told me I'd grow out of science stuff, now telling a room full of his peers that his daughter had shaped the future of the land they all worked on. And this time, he wasn't doing it behind my back. He was doing it with intention. That evening, as I walked through the barn to grab something from the truck, I heard Curtis talking to one of the ranch hands, Blake. Yeah, she's the brains behind the whole solar system here. Cut our energy costs by 1/3. His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. It was matter of fact, natural, like he'd been saying it for years. I smiled quietly to myself and kept walking. Later that night, Jason's oldest boy, Tyler, sat next to me on the porch steps. He was holding a notebook, one of those spiral-bound school pads that barely held together after a semester of use. Aunt Blake, he said, almost shyly, if I wanted to build something like Solis Grid when I grow up, where should I start? I looked at him and saw myself again, only this time, with permission. You start with what they tell you isn't yours, I said, and you keep going until they stop saying it. He didn't fully understand the weight of that yet, but one day he would. That was the moment I knew this story had changed. It wasn't just about me proving I belonged. It was about changing what that word even meant. I hadn't forced my way in. I hadn't demanded anything. I had simply kept doing the work until the work became too real, too strong, too valuable to be ignored. And now, the next generation wasn't asking for permission. They were asking for tools. 6 weeks later, I stood on a modest stage at the Brazoria County Community Center, accepting the Legacy Builder Award from a committee that, for most of my life, had seen me as a footnote in my own family's story. The room was filled with familiar faces, ranchers, teachers, neighbors I hadn't spoken to since I was 18. My father sat in the front row. He didn't record anything, didn't clap louder than anyone else, but he showed up in a clean shirt and nodded at the right moments. That was his version of applause. And for the first time, I didn't look to him for confirmation. I looked straight ahead, held the plaque in both hands, and delivered my speech. It wasn't long. I didn't talk about rejection or being excluded. I talked about soil, about how things grow, about how some seeds take longer to push through, about light and patience and refusing to rot just because the ground around you hasn't been tilled in years. Legacy, I said, isn't what's handed to you. It's what you keep building even when no one else sees it. Afterward, a few people came up to me with kind words. One woman said she had kept her daughter in school after reading about our program. Another man asked if I was the same Blake from the lively place who used to mess with wires behind the barn. Guess you made something out of that, he said with a chuckle. I nodded. Turns out, yeah, I did. Outside, as the sun dipped behind the county fairgrounds, Chase walked beside me in the parking lot. You ever think about how different things would have been if we'd listened to you sooner? I smiled without turning. Sure. But then again, maybe I wouldn't have built it the way I did. Without all that silence, I might have played safe. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, well, I'm glad you didn't. That was enough. Before I left, my father handed me a paper bag. Inside was a small metal tag, faded, but still legible. It was the serial plate from the broken irrigation pump I had tried to fix when I was 13. He'd told me not to touch it. I broke it anyway. He'd yelled. That night I cried. Not because it failed, but because I was never given a chance to learn. He kept the plate. All these years, I meant to throw it out. He said now, half smiling, glad I didn't. I drove home that night with the windows down and no music, just the hum of tires on road and the steady beat of my thoughts. I wasn't the girl who needed the front door anymore. I wasn't angry at the past, nor did I need to rewrite it. What mattered was the version I lived forward, one where I owned my name, my work, my space. At the office the next morning, I walked into our small greenhouse wing, the one built after our first funding round. Modeled loosely on the blueprint I'd drawn in high school and hidden in a sketchbook for years. The seedlings were healthy, reaching toward the light like they knew something was waiting. I placed the metal tag on the shelf beside them, a quiet reminder of everything that didn't grow once and everything that did. Anyway, I thought about every young girl in a small town being told she was too ambitious, too loud, too far from tradition. I thought about the ones sneaking into barns at night with headlamps and scrap parts and ideas no one understood yet. And I thought about how no one could stop them, not really, because real growth doesn't need permission, it needs persistence. The truth is, they never opened the front door for me, so I built my own entrance, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there will walk through it one day, never realizing that once. Someone had to stand outside and wait, and then knock once more, until the silence broke open and let the future in. Have you ever been told you didn't belong only to come back stronger, not for revenge, but to build something better if you have? Your story matters too. And if you're still waiting outside that door, just know this, you're not alone. Thank you for listening, and may you always choose the path that's yours, even if it starts in the back.